This is going to be the bulk of our discussion tonight. What I put together here tonight is to look at the annual financial report. We're going to take a look at a few key items, and then we're going to talk about the declining revenue and downsizing. Now, what you're going to see in my report is a lot of some of the similar things that you just heard tonight. So some of those things that we've already heard, I'll move through those fairly quickly. But we're going to dive into later on into more of the downsizing and what that looks like if if the revenue continues to decline, and what does that mean. So we're going to get into more of that as we go. So first, we're going to take a look at some of the highlights of the annual financial report. Next slide. So this one we've already seen before. I think Dr. Boza kind of talked about it. We did get another clean audit opinion in 2025. And as he mentions, we've passed every audit since at least 1997. I went back to see how far back we had audit records. I could only go back to 97. And we've had clean opinions ever since then. And then just a reminder that the audited financials do go to the finance committee, they do go to the board. And of course, they're included in the annual financial report to the HOD each and every year. Next slide. So the operating budget. So in 2025, MSMS experienced the third largest year-over-year percentage decline in dues revenue, 14%. And when we look back at the last 5 years, our 5-year average of lost dues revenue is a negative 7.6%, the 10-year average negative 5.4%. So you can see it's increasing. And like Dr. George mentioned, if it holds steady for this year, it maybe could be close to 12% year-over-year decline. The year's not over yet. We're still trying to get more members, but that's kind of where we're at right now. So the decline is continuing and it's accelerating. Now, as Dr. George, I think, mentioned, we had one-time grants, significant amounts from the state, $600,000. And with those, we were able to generate a consolidated operating surplus of over $400,000. Without those one-time grants, though, revenue would have declined year over year. And as Dr. George mentioned, these grants are not available for 2026, and we are projecting lower revenue because of it. Next slide. So reserve investments. They generated a 14.3% return in 2025. Our average annually since 2008, 8.2%. So a very good return there. The portfolio just over 10 million for MSMS when we consider the subsidiaries, about 11 million. Those investments are invested in a 70-30 portfolio mix of equity and fixed income. And the long-term strategy here, which we don't talk about a whole lot, although it is in the annual financial report to a certain extent, is to grow these reserves to a level where the income can fund a significant portion of MSMS's operating budget. Now, right now, it's about 5% of total revenue. I would love to get that to north of 50%. It's going to take some time to get there. But if it is that, what that has turned into, what those reserves have turned into, is a form of non-dues revenue to MSMS to fund the operations that MSMS has a bit more control over than maybe some of the other ones. And we're going to get to later on in this presentation, we're going to talk about using reserves. You know, what's the responsible way to use reserves? What's the irresponsible way to use reserves? Something we haven't talked about much over the years with this committee, but we are going to get into that because I think when we talk about this declining revenue, we talk about downsizing, we need to consider the reserves and how best to utilize those. Next slide. So these are just some graphs kind of talking about the same things that you've already heard earlier tonight. The highest total members that we've had over the last 44 years since 1981 was 2009 at 16,280. 2025, we ended the year, again, this is total members, dues paid and exempt, ended the year 2025 at 6,286. Again, lowest it's been in the last 44 years. Next slide. And this is just the dues paying members. You can see we topped out again, same period of time over the last 44 years since 1981, topped out in 2007 at 10,939. And we ended 2025 at 3,956. And as we mentioned, 2026 looks to be trending even lower than that. Next slide. All right, so this is the part of the presentation that the first part was really the annual financial report and kind of pulling out some of the highlights from that. Now, this is the part of the presentation that that I'll just say, and I told the board this. I've presented a similar report to both the finance committee and the board. Easily the most difficult report I've ever written, ever presented in my 2.5 decades at MSMS. This is not a report that I take any pleasure in. We talk about downsizing. We talk about really changing this organization from historically what it's been. But this is the reality of the situation. And this is information that the finance committee has heard, the board has heard. Now this committee is going to hear, and the delegation as well. By the way, I'm taking out a lot of pieces of this report, but the full written report is in the annual financial report, and it's under the treasurer's report section. So if you want to read the full report, it's in there. I encourage every delegate to do it. Next slide. So I thought to start off, why not? Let's have an executive summary. We're going to go into some pretty difficult things, some things that I think will be hard to digest, things we haven't talked about a whole lot over the years, but again, things we need to. So executive summary, I'm just going to read this because I think this kind of summarizes what we're going to get into here tonight. So we have effectively managed a 25-year revenue contraction through disciplined expense reductions and staff consolidations. That strategy has now been fully exhausted. The organization is entering a phase where continued revenue decline will directly translate into reductions in staff and essential services. Ultimately, it could mean becoming a 3-person organization focused only on the most basic functions of membership and limited advocacy. Next slide. So the long-term membership and revenue decline, again, Dr. Waters mentioned this, Dr. Bozick has mentioned this, Dr. George has mentioned this. MSMS has experienced over 25 years declining dues revenue, and over 17 years of declining non-dues revenue, active membership, lowest level in the last 4 decades. Next slide. Specifically, dues revenue decline. You can see we topped out there in 1999, about 4.4 million. We're now at 1.5 million. 2026 budgeted at 1.4 million, but we're trending lower than that as well. So even at 2025, 1.5 million, you can see 1981, we had 2.1 million, lowest it's been in 44 years. Next slide. Non-dues revenue, again, you can see we topped out in 2008, 11.1 million. 2025, you can see we had a bump from 2024, 2025, 4.9 million. Those are the one-time grants we got, the 600,000. What we're budgeting for 2026 is 4.2 million. So it's heading back down. The trend is continuing. Next slide. So what's been the operational response to the decline in revenue over the past 25 years? We've kind of talked about this before. As I mentioned, I think last year, we've had 4 CEOs, 4 chief operating officers, 9 membership directors, and 8 agency directors. These are the folks in charge of revenue. This is the number of people, different people that we've had fighting this decline in revenue over the past 25 years. So what did they do? What did the 4 CEOs do? Well, they implemented numerous cost reductions. Sold the headquarters building. We closed unprofitable businesses. We reduced staff benefits. Operational efficiencies were implemented across many departments. But the largest cost reduction ultimately came from reducing staff. Next slide. So staff reductions, again, this has already been talked about, 87% reduction, 154, a high of 154 in 1999. By the way, I joined MSMS December 1999. So I've been there every year from 154 down to 20. I've seen I've actually seen all of this firsthand, and obviously was a big part in all of the expense reductions, the restructuring, everything we did operational to make sure that we could continue to operate MSMS and keep moving on with our essential services. So, but one of the things we haven't talked about, 45% staff reduction occurred in the last 3 years alone. That's significant. Largest 3-year decline in staff that we've had in at least the last 25 years. So what this means right now, staff capacity has reached operational limits, and we're really at a point where there's very little to cut now without directly impacting core services. Next slide. So what's the reality of continued revenue decline? That's what happened in the past when, as the revenue was declining over those 25 years, we cut expenses, we restructured, we did all of these things. What are we going to do now? What if it continues? As I mentioned, we're already to that point where there's no easy cuts anymore that's not going to impact essential services. So we're really at the point now where we're going to begin generating deficits and we're going to face some difficult decisions. And really, we only got two options left. One is use reserves and the other is downsize the operations. Next slide. So this is something I mentioned earlier here in the presentation. I want to talk about the use of reserves. What's the responsible? We're first going to talk about the responsible use of reserves. Then we're going to talk about the irresponsible use of reserves. So we got to understand what reserves are actually for to start. And, the first thing I want to say is reserves are not intended to fund ongoing operations. They're a strategic asset meant to give us time and flexibility during periods of change. So using reserves responsibly really means three things there. It must be time limited. We're not talking about indefinite support. We're talking about a defined window. Second, it's got to be tied to a clear, actionable plan. Now, that could be restructuring, such as the governance reforms. And we're going to get to those here shortly, but there has to be a plan. Third, the reserve should be used to fund change, not preserve the status quo. Again, that could include things like one-time costs for restructuring or other strategic initiatives that position the organization for sustainability. We need to use reserves in a way that leads to financially stable future, not just extending our current trajectory. And the key takeaway here is this, and this is the last bullet point on the slide. Reserves can buy us time, but they must buy us change. And that's a responsible use of them. Next slide. So that's responsible. What is the irresponsible use of reserve? What does that look like? And this is where organizations can get themselves into some trouble. So irresponsible use of reserves typically shows up as repeatedly funding annual operating deficits with no clear plan to break even. It often includes delaying or avoiding difficult decisions, whether that's downsizing, governance restructuring reforms, whatever it is. And the risk here is not an immediate collapse, it's a gradual erosion. It really brings up the question, as if done in this way, as reserves are declining, there's something called a going concern risk. And this is something the auditors talk about on a regular basis, and that is there a concern that the organization is not going to be able to operate in the same way in the future, or even operate in the future? And when they start seeing a decline in reserves, and they see that it's just funding, there's no plan, it's just funding current operating deficits, they start asking the question, is there a going concern? And if it raises to a certain level, that will be included in their audit report. So they're looking at this. So this is one of the challenges of using the reserves this way. So using the reserves without a path to sustainability, it's not a strategy. It's a slow liquidation. So last bullet point on here, we have to ask ourselves this question: are we using reserves to change our trajectory or simply to delay difficult decisions? Next slide. So that brings us here to the governance reforms, and I won't repeat them. We've heard them here multiple times, but what are they designed to do? Reduce costs, free up staff admin time to spend more time growing membership and revenue, lower membership prices, and modernize decision-making. It's a fiduciary best practice to modernize governance to improve operational efficiencies. Now, as I mentioned, utilizing reserves to fund short-term operating deficits while these governance reforms are being implemented would be a fiscally responsible option. Next slide. So what if these governance reforms are rejected? It really is up to the House. If they're rejected, if the revenue continues to decline, as we're seeing here in 2026, and deficits start, well, that's when downsizing would likely begin. And as mentioned before, MSMS could eventually be reduced to a 3-person organization. The remaining staff, who would those 3 people be? Well, we'd have a CEO, an advocacy staff person, and a membership person. And at this stage of the organization, it would operate with limited services and limited resources. Probably take 3 to 5 years, and we're going to get into why 3 to 5 years here in a second. And again, based on the current trends, this year, 2026, we could be recommending this as earlier as later this year. Next slide. So the downsizing sequence. So if MSMS does begin a downsizing process, it's important for this committee, the House of Delegates, and I've mentioned this to the board as well, we all have to understand the optimal sequence in which operations should be reduced or discontinued. An orderly sequence protects the organization's financial position, maintains legal and regulatory compliance, and preserves the value of business assets that will be sold or closed. That's why it's got to be orderly. There's got to be a method to it because we're attempting to get to a baseline of 3 staff people. So we have to be orderly about that. We got to protect the organization. So the downsizing process should begin with the areas that are, and this might not make sense to most people, but it's got to begin in the areas that are the least essential to the organization's final stage of operations, not currently. And as you see here, you see on the slide, everyone's going to say, well, now wait a second. Advocacy and education, those are the most important things today, right? But when we enter into a downsizing, it's not about what's best for today. It's what the final stage is going to look like. And so we've got to look at that and then look at what can be eliminated quickly without complex transition requirements. And as we walk through these, you're going to see the easier ones in terms of that final stage and what's less complex. We got to go with the simple stuff first. Why? The goal is to minimize deficits as much as possible during the downsizing so we can retain the reserves for when we get to the end process. So number 1 on that list, advocacy. And we would likely reduce that staff from 3 to 1. And this would come first. So again, valued by many members, but it doesn't generate revenue directly. And it's entirely discretionary from a financial standpoint. We all know that the loss of advocacy effectiveness is a meaningful impact. But in the context of what we're talking about here, a multi-decade membership and revenue decline, it does not affect the viability of the wind down. In fact, these are the easiest cuts to make in terms of we've got to balance the budget as much as we can as we're continuing to decline. Next one, education programs will be closed. So again, while education is visible to members and some join for the free CME, right? It can be discontinued almost immediately. There are some, we do schedule these out 6 and 12 months, so there is a little bit of time lag there, but the financial risk of closing it down is minimal. And again, reducing education programs helps to realign operations with the society's reduced capacity in the future structure. Again, we got to think about what's the future structure look like. Next one is the membership department. And this would be reduced to a basic administrative support. We reduce that from 3 to 1. Subsidiary businesses, we would be looking at selling and closing those on day 1. Once this would be approved by the board in the future, potentially, hopefully not, but if it does, we'd be looking at finding buyers. We'd be looking at the organizations themselves, making sure that everything is set up in the right way, that when we look for buyers, they're going to want to pay the highest price. So we would be looking at doing that at the beginning, but there has to be careful planning with all of the subsidiary businesses due to the financial and regulatory implications. So it would start early, the planning, but we would execute that later. And then you can see the last number 5 there. The last ones to go. Our Chief Operating Officer would need to remain to oversee all of these operational transitions as we're downsizing. That position will be eliminated at the end of the process. Myself would remain as well through the final stage to make sure that we've got accurate financial reporting and compliant closure of all the financial and legal obligations. And then my role would be eliminated as well. Don't need a CFO when you just have a basic membership organizations collecting dues. Next slide. All right, so now that we understand the sequence, what are the options? So really, we'll get 2 options here. We can keep staff and use reserves to fund operating deficits. Only recommend this if the governance restructuring is approved. And then under this, reserves would be used to fund operating deficits for a period of time. It would be temporary. Again, we have a plan that would be a responsible use of reserves. And this would allow staff additional time to attempt to reverse declining revenue. The other option, and we would probably recommend this if the governance reforms are not approved, start downsizing immediately once operating deficits begin. And as I mentioned earlier, recommendation to the board, I mentioned this to the board as well, it could be coming as early as later this year. It's whenever we start projecting deficits, whether it's projecting it for 2027 or projecting it later this year. Once we do, we will be bringing something to the board to decide what we need to do moving forward. Next slide. So in conclusion, let me just read these 2 bullet points here. MSMS has demonstrated strong cost management over a prolonged period of declining revenue, successfully preserving core services through successive rounds of expense and staff reductions, and this has been done by 4 different CEOs over the 25 years. However, it has now reached a structural inflection point where further revenue declines cannot be offset by additional cost cutting without materially impairing its core mission and member value. Next slide. The governance changes. These reforms will result in cost savings, as I mentioned, reduce staff administrative time so they can focus on growing revenue, and reduce the membership price point to entice new members who see price as a barrier. And then the last part of it was the modernized decision-making. And these changes, I just want to say, I just want to be clear with this. I think we've all been pretty clear tonight. These are not, the governance reforms are not a magic pill to solve all of our ills. It is just the next right decision that a responsible fiduciary, a fiscally responsible organization is going to do. We've done it on the operations side. This is the last part. As Dr. George has said, he's done what he can. The CEOs before them have done what they can. This is that last part. But what it does do, not a magic pill, that last bullet point there, these changes improve the probabilities of avoiding a downsize. It improves the probabilities. And in life, and I've said this many times, there's no certainties in life, only probabilities. This decision would do that. And I'll conclude with this. This is how I ended my presentation with the board. And it's simply this. We're running out of options. And we're running out of time.